The NFL appears to be sending mixed signals when it comes to its DEI initiatives.
Sources told The Athletic that the NFL would be axing the slogan "End Racism" from the Super Bowl end zone. They will instead have "Choose Love" and "It Takes All of Us."
Commissioner Roger Gooddell, however, had this to say earlier this week.
Listen, we got into diversity efforts because we felt it was the right thing for the National Football League. And we're going to continue those efforts because we've not only convinced ourselves, I think we've proven ourselves that it does make the NFL better. So we're not in this because it's a trend to get in it or a trend to get out of it. Our efforts are fundamental in trying to attract the best possible talent into the National Football League, both on and off the field, as I said previously.
NFL spokesperson Brian McCarthy told The Athletic that the New Orleans terror attack, Los Angeles wildfires, and the deadly plane crash in Washington, D.C. were part of the reasons why the league decided to go a different route with the end zone slogans.
The NFL began adding phrases to their end zones on players' uniforms after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. Sports and political commentator Keith Olbermann wasn't too happy about the move, to put it mildly. Guess what, NFL? If you're against Stop Racism, that means you're for racism. F you and every one of your advertisers.
Some mild-mannered commentary from Keith Olbermann. Blaze media contributor TJ Moe wrote on X, DEI ignores talent, promotes group identity instead. The NFL is going to go the way of the NBA. Outkick founder Clay Travis wrote, congrats to the NFL on ending racism, big achievement. Gotta admit, didn't think racists were going to change their minds based on end zone slogans, but I was wrong. It worked. So, the end zone apparently said end racism. I wasn't paying enough attention to know that. Was that always the case?
You weren't scrutinizing the NFL end
Is that in all Super Bowl games or all games?
I think it's been all recent Super Bowls, or several recent Super Bowls.
Yeah, so we've ended end racism.
Yes.
Great. Fantastic.
So I, as you might guess, have a different view of this than you do. Or
but if it's just going to, well, go ahead and say your
Which is that
first.
The argument that, oh, well, you put a slogan in an end zone and therefore you haven't ended racism, therefore you shouldn't put the slogan in, is not true. That's not how change happens. Change happens by people making repeated attempts in small ways and large, ripples of hope, to use RFK Sr.'s famous metaphor, that people, by standing up for the right thing repeatedly in all kinds of different ways, ultimately creates the kind of propulsive force for actual change.
Right. The criticism of this kind of thing is that it's very performative, it's very, why end racism and not end poverty or end war or end sexism or like, especially if there's only be one message, is that even the most pressing cultural or social issue? It just seems very reactive to a single news event, the George Floyd event, in a almost cynical way in which they're trying to say, look at us, we're a corporation, we get it, we're so progressive guys, we just love us too, we're good. Overlook any other issues you might have with us because we're against racism. Look, we wrote it on the thing.
No, but here's the thing about that argument, Robby. Someone like arguing from your perspective says, well, is end racism really more important than ending sexism or ending poverty? But actually, I don't think you would support writing ending poverty or ending sexism in the end zone either. And so I think that the problem is that those arguments, is that why are you elevating this one thing above the other thing, typically comes from people who say you shouldn't do any of it.
I think that's true in a lot of, I think, to be fair to that point, I agree with you, like when they go, well, all lives matter, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, but there was a specific problem here we're trying to address. This is a little different, though, because there's a finite amount of space. Like, you only have room to write one thing. So there, I think it is fair to invite the question, well, why are you writing that instead of something that what you want to write, pay people fairly or what? Like, there's anything you could write. It just seems very reactive to the news. But
wouldn't you criticize? I mean, I'm not actually trying to be.
I just don't think it should say anything political.
Well,
really.
Exactly. That's the whole thing. You don't think it should, and I think it's perfectly honourable that it should. Now, we could dispute what exactly is the bigger ill. Racism, I think, clearly still is a scourge in this country that causes very real problems. If you want to write end sexism instead, I've no objection to that. But I don't think that it is a bad thing for those kinds of messages to be sent out. And I also don't think, one of the first quotes we read there from the right was something to the effect of DEI ignores talent. That's not what DEI does. DEI, at least in its most useful manifestations, allows talent to come through that would otherwise have been ignored or sidelined because of reasons of traditional biases.
Well, if that's all we mean by DEI, then I'm all for it. But what many conservatives are trying to purge when they take aim at DEI is the opposite of merit. If it's just outreach to people, I mean, I've said this before in the program, it's just outreach to people who don't know about opportunities, but who would otherwise qualify, that's all great. And diversity can be a good thing in many contexts if we're considering all sorts of diversity, including where you grew up and how you feel about things and what your actual ideas are.
Well,
but
and
if it's
also
just
other
that
issues
people,
like disability and so forth, which are not racial or gender issues. But anyway,
yes,
go ahead,
but
yeah.
if we're giving preferential treatment to people for reason other than strict merit, if we're taking, if you go to an admission system, you're taking people who scored less well on the entrance exam or whatever it is, but because you want to construct a more artificially diverse racial or gender or whatever it is populace, that is what we mean by DEI, and that is what we're getting rid of. That and also the training component, the seminars, which I think even most liberals now have concluded are a waste of time and are very patronizing and not scientifically well-founded.
Some of the excesses of the seminars I would agree with you on, but I think that the argument about lowered standards and so forth, that came up, for example, in the recent plane crash here in Washington, D.C., which was a very tragic incident, and Trump initially or immediately started blaming DEI for that. A, there was no evidence in that case at all. But secondly, and this came up with one day when our friend Amber was in your seat, the whole testing process there was not about lowering standards for admission. It was replacing a previous measure that had included things like work experience in air traffic controlling. There are private air traffic controllers, then there are the FAA air traffic controllers. And the DEI effort there was intended to redress a historical imbalance to enable people who were performing very well on a test measuring traits to be recruited. There was no lowering standards there.
It sounds like you've looked at this more closely than I have. Are you referring to there is a lawsuit over this. I agree with you that I don't think it has to. I don't think this specific incident has to do with any of this. As far as I can tell from the plane crash over the Potomac last week, seems to be due to just way too many planes and helicopters sharing the same narrow airspace. And if you talk to helicopter pilots in DC, all they'll say is, yeah, we've been warning forever that this is dangerous and something like this could happen. It's infuriating. I don't think it actually does have anything to do. But the lawsuit over, 10 years ago or something like that, the FAA's, my understanding was, yes, they scrapped a testing, or they scrapped an admittance thing that was resulting in perfectly qualified people get accepted, and then they realized that was a mistake, and now all those people have sued. So I don't...
No, that's not how I would characterize it. I think that what happened is people sued because they had failed a new test, which was intended as a multiple choice test measuring things like decision making and so on and so forth. They failed that test. They are then suing, arguing that that test was biased against them. I don't believe that it was. It was not intended, your racial identity was not determining one way or another how you performed on that test. So I would dispute the characterization of that.
All right, well, we'll have to get into that one a little bit more thoroughly at a later date. Next up on Rising, we'll have an interview with a research fellow, Nick Cleveland, about think tanks and their lack of transparency. Stay tuned.